There are movies that make you scream, and then there are movies that were so terrifying. Entire countries tried to erase them. From scenes too disturbing for theaters to stories that blurred the line between fiction and madness, these films didn't just scare audiences. They shook governments, churches, and censors to their core. Tonight, we dive into 10 horror movies so shocking, so grotesque, and so psychologically haunting that they were banned around the world. Each one has a story of fear, outrage, and obsession that proves how horror can be too real for comfort. So, if you dare, turn off the lights, hit play, and join us on this forbidden journey into cinema's darkest nightmares. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more chilling stories from the shadows. 1. The Exorcist, 1973, banned in multiple countries for its disturbing religious themes and shocking possession scenes. Few films have ever terrified audiences or angered censors quite like The Exorcist. Directed by William Friedkin and adapted from William Peter Blatty's best-selling novel, the 1973 classic tells the harrowing story of Regan McNeil, a sweet 12-year-old girl whose life spirals into horror after she becomes possessed by a demonic entity. As her desperate mother turns to the church for help, 2 priests are called upon to perform a terrifying exorcism that will test their faith, sanity, and very souls. Upon release, The Exorcist wasn't just a movie, it was a cultural earthquake. Audiences screamed, fainted, and even vomited during screenings. Paramedics were reportedly stationed outside cinemas. Some church leaders warned that simply watching the film could invite demonic possession. For many, the line between fiction and reality blurred, and the terror felt real. Religious groups across the world condemned the film for its blasphemous imagery, crucifixes used in shocking ways, holy water splashed in fury, and explicit scenes involving a possessed child speaking in guttural demonic voices. The realistic depiction of evil, combined with Friedkin's documentary-style direction, made it feel disturbingly authentic. Censorship boards quickly reacted. The Exorcist was banned in multiple countries, including Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines, where church officials called it spiritually dangerous. In the United Kingdom, local councils prohibited screenings, and the film was unavailable on home video for over a decade. Some nations only allowed heavily censored versions, cutting out key scenes that today are considered essential to the story's power. Behind the scenes, strange events added to the film's notorious reputation. Fires broke out on set, actors were injured, and several people connected to the production reportedly died before the movie's release. These coincidences fueled rumors that The Exorcist itself was cursed, an idea that only made the public more obsessed with seeing it. Despite the controversy, the film was a massive success, earning over $400 million worldwide and becoming the first horror movie ever nominated for a Best Picture Oscar. It redefined the genre, proving that horror could be intelligent, emotional, and deeply spiritual. To this day, The Exorcist remains one of the most powerful and unsettling films ever made. Its terrifying imagery and haunting themes still challenge audiences to confront their deepest fears, not just of the supernatural, but of faith, doubt, and the darkness within the human soul. Whether viewed as a masterpiece or a movie that should never have been made, one thing is certain: no other film has ever possessed the world quite like The Exorcist. 2. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980, infamous for its extreme gore and disturbing realism that led to murder accusations. Few films have ever blurred the line between fiction and reality as dangerously as Cannibal Holocaust. Directed by Ruggero Deodato, this Italian horror film follows a group of American documentary filmmakers who travel deep into the Amazon rainforest to capture footage of indigenous tribes, only to become victims of their own cruelty and hubris. The story unfolds through found footage, depicting their shocking fate at the hands of the very people they exploited. From the moment it premiered, Cannibal Holocaust became one of the most controversial movies in cinematic history. Audiences and critics were horrified by its unflinching depiction of violence, sexual assault, and animal cruelty. The film's realistic special effects, combined with its raw, documentary-style cinematography, were so convincing that many believed the murders shown on screen were real. The controversy reached a boiling point when Italian authorities arrested director Ruggero Deodato shortly after the film's release. He was charged with obscenity and suspected murder, as prosecutors genuinely believed he had killed the actors on camera. Deodato had to bring his cast to court, alive and well, to prove his innocence. Only after the actors publicly appeared did the charges of murder get dropped, though the movie was still banned in dozens of countries for its graphic and disturbing content. One of the most troubling aspects of Cannibal Holocaust was its real-life animal killings, which were filmed on set. This act of cruelty caused outrage among audiences and remains one of the most criticized elements of the film today. In countries like Australia, Norway, and the United Kingdom, the movie was banned for decades, with some nations only recently allowing censored versions to be released. Yet, beneath all the controversy lies a shocking layer of social commentary. Cannibal Holocaust was, in many ways, a critique of sensationalist media and Western exploitation. The supposed civilized filmmakers manipulate the natives and stage violent acts to make their documentary more dramatic, only to face true savagery in return. Deodato's message was clear. Perhaps the real cannibals are not the tribes in the jungle, but modern society itself. Today, Cannibal Holocaust is remembered as a landmark in horror cinema, both reviled and revered. It pioneered the found footage genre that would later inspire films like The Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity. Despite its disturbing legacy, it stands as a chilling reminder of how far filmmakers might go in the pursuit of realism, and how easily audiences can be convinced that the nightmare on screen is real. Even decades later, few movies dared to push boundaries the way Cannibal Holocaust did. It remains banned in several countries, a film so brutal and provocative that it continues to haunt the history of cinema. 3. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, banned for years due to its shocking violence, disturbing tone, and raw, documentary-like realism. When the Texas Chainsaw Massacre hit theaters in 1974, audiences weren't ready for what they saw. Directed by Tobe Hooper, this low-budget horror masterpiece followed a group of friends traveling through rural Texas, who stumble upon a family of cannibals led by the terrifying, chainsaw-wielding killer known as Leatherface. What begins as a simple road trip quickly descends into a nightmarish fight for survival that redefined the horror genre forever. Despite its title, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is surprisingly light on visible gore, but what it lacks in blood, it makes up for in terror. The film's grainy cinematography, gritty atmosphere, and relentless pacing make it feel brutally real. Every scream, every sound of the chainsaw, every glimpse of Leatherface's human skin mask creates an almost suffocating sense of dread. It was this raw, documentary-like realism that shocked viewers and censors around the world. The film was immediately controversial. Many countries, including the United Kingdom, Australia, and parts of Scandinavia, banned it outright. In the UK, censors refused to give it a classification, effectively prohibiting its release for years. Critics called it morally insane and depraved, while audiences reportedly fainted or fled theaters in panic. In several U.S. cities, it was pulled from cinemas after complaints of people screaming or vomiting during screenings. What made the Texas Chainsaw Massacre so unsettling wasn't just the violence, it was the feeling that you were watching something real. Something that could actually happen. Tobe Hooper famously based parts of the story on the crimes of real-life murderer Ed Gein, whose gruesome acts inspired multiple horror icons, including Psycho's Norman Bates and The Silence of the Lambs' Buffalo Bill. This connection to true events gave the movie a disturbing credibility that only deepened its infamy. Yet beneath all the chaos, the film also carried a bleak message about American life in the 1970s, a reflection of societal decay, economic hardship, and the death of the post-war dream. The twisted cannibal family represented a grotesque parody of the traditional American household, surviving off the flesh of others in a broken world. Over time, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre went from being a banned exploitation film to one of the most influential horror movies ever made. It paved the way for the slasher genre, inspiring countless filmmakers, from Wes Craven to Rob Zombie. Despite its bans and censorship, it became a cult classic, studied for its psychological power and minimalist terror. Even 50 years later, The sound of that revving chainsaw still sends shivers down the spine, a reminder that true horror doesn't always need blood. Just raw fear. 4. A Serbian Film, 2010, considered one of the most disturbing and controversial films ever made. Banned in over 40 countries for its extreme depictions of violence and exploitation. When A Serbian Film premiered in 2010, it immediately became one of the most infamous movies in cinematic history. Directed by Srđan Spasojević, the film tells the story of Milos, a retired adult film actor who agrees to participate in one last mysterious project, only to discover he's been trapped in a nightmarish snuff film operation. What follows is a descent into pure depravity, pushing every possible moral and psychological boundary of what cinema can portray. Unlike most horror films, A Serbian Film doesn't rely on ghosts or monsters. Its terror comes from humanity itself. The story unfolds like a dark metaphor for exploitation, corruption, and trauma in post-war Serbia. Spasojević claimed it was a political allegory, representing how governments and institutions violate their people for profit and power. But while the message may have been symbolic, the imagery was so graphic that most audiences couldn't see past the horror on screen. The film features acts so shocking and taboo that many countries refused to release it. Even in censored form, it was banned outright in Spain, Norway, Australia, Brazil, and New Zealand, and faced criminal investigation in the United Kingdom, where authorities called it obscene material. Even hardcore horror fans and critics were divided. Some defended it as artistic protest. Others dismissed it as sadistic shock cinema with no redeeming value. During its initial screenings, audience reactions ranged from fainting to outright panic. In some film festivals, organizers were threatened with lawsuits for simply showing it. Serbian cultural groups condemned it for painting their country in a monstrous light, while others argued it was an uncomfortable but necessary mirror of social decay and trauma. Despite the outrage, A Serbian Film has developed a cult following among horror scholars and extreme cinema enthusiasts. It's often compared to other, banned for life, movies like Salò, or the 120 Days of Sodom and Cannibal Holocaust. Yet it stands apart for its modern political context and deliberate provocation. The controversy surrounding it still rages on. Many believe that even mentioning the film gives it too much power. Others see it as an unflinching artistic statement about desensitization in a media-saturated world. Whatever one's stance, it remains a cinematic line few dare to cross. A movie that forces you to confront your limits as a viewer and as a human being. Even today, more than a decade later, A Serbian Film remains almost unwatchable, not because of its gore, but because of its message, that horror can live not just on screen, but within society itself. 5. The Human Centipede 2, full sequence, 2011, so grotesque that even seasoned horror fans found it unbearable to watch. This sequel took body horror to unprecedented extremes. If the original The Human Centipede, first sequence, was shocking, its 2011 sequel was an all-out assault on the senses. Directed once again by Tom Six, The Human Centipede 2, full sequence, took the infamous concept, surgically connecting humans' mouth to anus, and stripped away any trace of dark humor or restraint that the first film had. What remained was a brutal, monochrome nightmare that pushed cinema's tolerance for depravity to its absolute breaking point. The film follows Martin Lomax, a mentally unstable parking garage attendant obsessed with the first Human Centipede movie. Inspired by its fictional horror, Martin sets out to recreate it in real life, only bigger and far more horrific. Instead of 3 victims, he kidnaps 12 people and attempts to build a 12-person centipede using crude tools, duct tape, and sheer madness. The result isn't science fiction, it's psychological collapse filmed in excruciating, graphic detail. Unlike most horror films that rely on tension or fear, The Human Centipede 2 is pure visceral revulsion. Every frame is designed to disgust, disturb, and confront the viewer with the darkest aspects of obsession and violence. Its black and white cinematography adds to the film's sickly, documentary-like tone, making it feel like an unholy blend of Eraserhead and a snuff film. The reaction from critics, audiences, and governments was immediate and fierce. The British Board of Film Classification, BBFC, outright banned the film, stating that it posed a real risk of harm to viewers. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada followed suit, while even the US release came with heavy cuts and content warnings. Some cinemas that dared to screen it faced protests and walkouts. Tom Six defended his film as a commentary on the absurdity of censorship and the audience's appetite for violence, claiming it was a film about obsession, not for the weak of stomach. Yet even many horror veterans and reviewers condemned it as too far. Roger Ebert refused to review it, calling it beyond the line of criticism. Despite, or perhaps because of, its notoriety, The Human Centipede 2 achieved cult status in the underground horror community. Fans dissect it for its meta-commentary, a horror movie about a man corrupted by horror movies, while others see it simply as an endurance test for the truly fearless. More than a decade later, the film's legacy endures as a boundary marker, a point in cinematic history where filmmakers asked, "How far is too far?" and found the answer staring back in horror. 6. Hostel, 2005, sparked moral outrage worldwide for its brutal torture sequences and unapologetic depiction of sadism, redefining what mainstream horror could get away with. When Hostel hit theaters in 2005, audiences weren't ready for what they were about to witness. Directed by Eli Roth and produced by Quentin Tarantino, this film didn't just scare people, it shocked them. What began as a story about three American backpackers traveling through Europe quickly spiraled into a grotesque nightmare of human trafficking, pain, and perverse pleasure. The movie introduced the concept of torture tourism, where wealthy elites pay to abduct and mutilate victims for entertainment. Unlike traditional horror, Hostel stripped away supernatural elements and showed horror as something disturbingly human. The violence wasn't stylized or cinematic, it was raw, unrelenting, and graphic to the point of nausea. Audiences squirmed, screamed, and in many cases, walked out of theaters. Critics coined the term torture porn to describe Hostel and similar films that followed, accusing them of glorifying pain. Yet Roth argued it was a reflection of Western voyeurism, a mirror held up to a culture addicted to watching suffering on screen. In several countries, the film faced immediate bans or severe censorship. Germany, New Zealand, Iceland, and Finland either pulled it from cinemas or demanded dozens of cuts. Even in the US, some theaters refused to show it unedited. The Czech Republic's tourism board protested, claiming the movie painted their nation as a den of murder and depravity. But beneath the gore, Hostel had something deeper to say. It explored how privilege and desensitization make people monsters, how violence becomes entertainment when it's far from home. The idea that the victims were Americans, usually the heroes of horror films, made audiences uncomfortable in ways few slashers ever had. Despite the controversy, Hostel became a massive commercial success, grossing over $80 million worldwide on a $5 million budget. It inspired 2 sequels, countless imitators, and an entire subgenre that blurred the line between fear and revulsion. For better or worse, it proved that extreme horror had a place in mainstream cinema. Today, Hostel remains a cultural milestone, not just for its shock value, but for how it made audiences question their own fascination with violence. Was it too much, or just honest about what people secretly want to see? That debate continues, long after the screams faded. 7. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. Banned for decades for its graphic sexual violence and unflinching portrayal of revenge. This film divided critics and audiences more than almost any other in horror history. When I Spit on Your Grave was released in 1978, it wasn't just controversial, it was explosive. Directed by Meir Zarchi, the film follows Jennifer Hills, a young writer who retreats to a remote cabin to work on her novel, only to be brutally assaulted by a group of men. Left for dead, Jennifer survives, and what follows is not a horror of helplessness, but of vengeance. One by one, she hunts down her attackers, turning the horror back on them with chilling precision. What made the movie infamous wasn't just its content, but how it presented it. The assault scenes are long, graphic, and painfully realistic, so much so that even seasoned horror fans struggled to watch them. But unlike other exploitation films of its time, the violence that follows isn't about titillation, it's about reclaiming power. Jennifer's revenge is brutal. unflinching, and deeply personal, forcing viewers to confront their own discomfort with the victim-turned-avenger dynamic. Critics were outraged. Roger Ebert called it a vile bag of garbage, and many theaters outright refused to screen it. The film was banned in Ireland, Norway, Germany, and the UK, where it became one of the most notorious titles on the Video Nasties list in the 1980s. Even decades later, censored versions continued to circulate under heavy restrictions. Yet, over time, I Spit on Your Grave gained a cult following, particularly among feminist film scholars and horror fans who saw it as a twisted reflection of trauma and empowerment. It challenged gender roles in horror, a genre where women were often victims, not victors, and dared to make audiences feel the pain and anger that real survivors face. Despite its reputation, I Spit on Your Grave has inspired remakes, sequels, and academic debate, cementing its legacy as one of the most divisive horror films ever made. Some still condemn it as exploitative trash, others defend it as a raw, confrontational piece of cinema that forced society to look at the brutality it pretends doesn't exist. Love it or hate it, this film changed horror forever, not by scaring audiences with monsters, but by showing that the most terrifying horrors are the ones humans inflict on each other. 8. The Last House on the Left, 1972, Wes Craven's early film that redefined the limits of horror and censorship, shocking audiences with its brutal realism and unflinching portrayal of revenge. When The Last House on the Left premiered in 1972, it instantly polarized viewers and critics alike. Directed by Wes Craven in his feature debut, the film follows two teenage girls who are kidnapped and brutally assaulted by a gang of criminals. The story escalates as the girls' parents track down the perpetrators and exact a horrifyingly realistic vengeance. The raw, almost documentary-like filming style made the violence feel painfully authentic, creating an atmosphere of dread that was unlike anything audiences had experienced before. The film's unflinching depiction of assault and retaliation caused it to be banned or heavily censored in numerous countries, including the United Kingdom, Australia, and Norway. Viewers were horrified not only by the physical brutality but also by the psychological tension and moral ambiguity presented in the story. Craven's use of minimalist effects, tight close-ups, and the gritty rural setting amplified the sense of terror, making audiences feel trapped alongside the victims. Beyond the shock value, The Last House on the Left challenged traditional horror narratives by placing ordinary people in situations of extreme violence and forcing them to confront their own capacity for revenge. The film blurred the lines between good and evil, victim and perpetrator, and in doing so, it ignited heated debates on censorship, morality, and the responsibilities of filmmakers. Despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, the movie achieved cult status over time. It inspired discussions about realism in horror, influenced the slasher genre, and established Wes Craven as a filmmaker unafraid to push cinematic boundaries. Today, The Last House on the Left is remembered as both a shocking horror classic and a provocative social commentary on violence and justice. 9. Grotesque, 2009, a Japanese torture horror so extreme it was outright banned in the UK, shocking audiences with relentless, unflinching brutality. Directed by Koji Shiraishi, Grotesque follows a young couple who are abducted by a sadistic, anonymous captor. What starts as a terrifying hostage situation quickly descends into a nightmarish display of torture and psychological manipulation. Unlike conventional horror films, Grotesque spares no detail. Every scream, every injury, and every moment of terror is captured with clinical precision, leaving viewers both horrified and mesmerized. Its unrelenting intensity and realistic portrayal of pain earned it an infamous reputation in the global horror community. The UK authorities were so disturbed by the content that the British Board of Film Classification, BBFC, refused to grant it a release certificate, effectively banning it outright. Other countries also censored or limited its release due to extreme depictions of violence and cruelty. Even seasoned horror fans have described watching Grotesque as a physically uncomfortable experience, with some leaving theaters unable to finish the screening. What sets Grotesque apart from other torture films is its focus on psychological torment as much as physical suffering. The captor's meticulous planning, the couple's helplessness, and the escalating tension create a pervasive sense of dread. This methodical depiction makes the viewer complicit in witnessing the horror, heightening the emotional impact and leaving lasting unease. Despite, or because of, its notoriety, Grotesque has become a cult phenomenon among extreme horror enthusiasts. Its influence can be seen in other Japanese, torture porn films and has sparked debate on the ethics of depicting violence in cinema. The film pushes the boundaries of what can be shown on screen, challenging audiences to confront their own limits of endurance. Even today, Grotesque is remembered as one of the most controversial and intense horror films of the 21st century. A stark example of cinema's ability to shock, disturb, and provoke reflection on the darkest sides of human cruelty. 10. Salò, or The 120 Days of Sodom, 1975, a film so politically and sexually explicit that it remains banned in several nations even today, challenging the boundaries of cinema and morality. Directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini, Salò, or The 120 Days of Sodom is an unflinching adaptation of the Marquis de Sade's infamous novel. Transposed into fascist Italy during World War II, the story follows a group of wealthy, corrupt officials who kidnap teenagers and subject them to unspeakable acts of torture, sexual abuse, and psychological degradation over the course of 120 days. Unlike conventional horror, the film presents its horrors in a cold, clinical style, devoid of cinematic flourish, which makes the events feel disturbingly real and morally unrelenting. Upon release, Salò provoked immediate outrage. Its graphic depiction of sexual violence, sadism, and political corruption led to bans in Italy, the United Kingdom, Australia, and many other countries. Even today, censored or edited versions are often the only ones legally available in certain regions. Critics described it as morally indefensible, while some scholars argue it is a piercing critique of authoritarianism, consumerism, and the dehumanizing effects of power. Pasolini intended the film as a political statement, highlighting the mechanisms of control and cruelty in totalitarian systems. What makes Salò particularly haunting is its lack of traditional narrative relief or heroic characters. The camera observes the atrocities without interruption, forcing viewers into a position of uncomfortable witness. Its focus on human depravity, both sexual and political, ensures that the horror resonates far beyond the screen, confronting audiences with the darkest potentials of authority and oppression. Despite its notoriety, Salò has endured as a subject of academic study and debate. It is regarded by some as an essential, if disturbing, work of art, reflecting the power of cinema to provoke thought and challenge societal taboos. For others, it remains a film too extreme to watch, a boundary of cinematic extremity that continues to polarize viewers decades after its creation. Even today, Salò, or The 120 Days of Sodom stands as a grim reminder that some films are meant not to entertain, but to confront, forcing society to face the depths of human cruelty and corruption. And there you have it, 10 of the most banned and controversial horror films that pushed the boundaries of cinema and shocked audiences worldwide. From supernatural possession to extreme torture, these movies challenged what society would tolerate on screen and left lasting marks on the horror genre. Which of these films do you think is the most disturbing? Or which one would you dare to watch? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to like, thumbs up, share, repeat button, and subscribe bell for more shocking, thought-provoking stories from the world of film.